Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming to what I'm sure will be a fantastic conversation with Daniel Hannan. May I extend the thanks to Bob Day and the Burt Kelly Research Centre for making this facility available to them. It's fantastic to be able to get like-minded people in the same room to hear from one of, I think, the world's most influential conservatives, is how, one of the UK's top 10 conservatives, but I think he's one of the world's most influential as well, not just you, Bob, but Daniel Hannan. And there are a few of us, I think, in this room who have fought long, lonely battles with Burt Kelly, or like Burt Kelly, I think, over the years. It's a great pleasure to introduce Daniel tonight because I met him a couple of times over the last 3 years, and I've always found him to be very good company, very charming, and very effective in persuading people to his point of view, and I think that's been recognised by his growing media appearances and his acknowledgement as one of the great speakers in the European Parliament. He's seen by many as one of the preeminent conservatives, and indeed there are people who have said he's going to be a future Prime Minister of Great Britain, of England, and we'd like to see that one day, Daniel, so I'm not sure whether that's not going to happen. You can tell us all about that, I'm sure. But what's probably not known about someone of Daniel's high profile is that he was born in Lima, in Peru. He was educated, he's had a very good education at Marlborough College and Oriel College in Oxford, where he studied modern history. He speaks English, French and Spanish, and he's learning a bit of Australian, I think. So we can say hola, we can say bonsoir, and we can say g'day, and you'll get all of them. I guess I explained to my children that if they googled Daniel Hannan today and looked at the YouTube clip, they would see something that has struck a chord with so many people across the world and has received 3 million views. And of course, that was Daniel's explanation, I will call it that, in the European Parliament to Gordon Brown about the devalued Prime Minister of a devalued government, and to say it was prescient and it reflects the view and message that so many Prime Ministers and leaders, parliamentary leaders, particularly in Western Europe, need to heed, goes without saying. Daniel is also a very accomplished author and writer. He writes regularly for the Daily Telegraph blog in the UK, where I'm an avid reader. He's written for the Wall Street Journal, the Spectator, the Sunday Telegraph, the Catholic Herald, Freedom Today, De Welt and the Brussels Journal. He's written many books, and one of which is not in my list here, but is The Plan. It was about a plan for rejuvenating Britain when the Tories took power, and it was all about empowering democracy and empowering the people to make decisions and influencing their own political leaders. But he's also written books, Time for a Fresh Start in Europe, A Guide to the Amsterdam Treaty, The Euro, Bad for Business, The Challenge of the East, What If Britain Votes No, The New Road to Serfdom, A Letter of Warning to America. All of these books were written well before the current crisis in Europe, and it's something to say that a politician has been able to anticipate the problems that will be eventuated, and it's just a question now for all of us to make sure that the message is heeded. He strongly believes that the EU is adversely affecting its constituent nations. It makes them poorer, it makes them less democratic and less free, and he seeks to warn other nations about Britain's mistakes in the hope that they can avoid government expansion, centralisation and abandonment of the sovereignty experienced in Britain. He is a dedicated advocate to the Conservative cause, an inspiring example to all of us who strive to make our country better for future generations. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd ask you to please welcome Daniel Hannan.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good day. And Corey, thank you for those very kind words. It's not often that we MEPs get talked about in that generous way. We're not, in general, the most popular people. Don't all feel you've got to rush forward and contradict me when I say that. We've got used to it over the years. Quite how low our profile is, quite how invisible we are as members of the European Parliament, was borne in on me very forcefully shortly after I was elected, when an extraordinary thing happened and a constituent telephoned me. This almost never happens when you're an MEP. This guy phoned me at home, which was the number he had, and he said, "Are you my MEP?" I said, "Yes, sir, yes I am. How wonderful to hear from you. What can I do to help?" He said, "Yeah, good, I'm glad I've got you. It's my drains. They're all blocked up. They're in a terrible way. And I want to know what you're going to do about it." Of course, didn't want to let him down. It was so rare that anyone had ever called an MEP about anything. So I said, tell you what, sir, you stay on the line. I am going to give you the number of your local council, and the person you want to talk to there is the environmental health officer. Oh, he said, environmental health officer? Oh, I don't know if I want to take it that high. So it's without any false modesty that I stand here in Adelaide this evening. I must tell you about the only Euro MP who doesn't have this problem. The one Euro MP who has instant name recognition wherever he speaks, and that is a Christian Democrat colleague of mine from Luxembourg who glories in the name of Mr. Goebbels. And I will never forget the first time that Mr. Goebbels spoke in the chamber, and I promise you this is an absolutely true story. The man in the chair that day was a British Labour MEP called David Martin. And when he saw the name Goebbels on the speaker list, there was a moment of pure faulty towers. You could see the speaker becoming visibly agitated, almost muttering to himself, don't mention the war, don't mention the war. Goebbels' name was moving higher and higher up the electronic board. It finally got to Mr. Goebbels' turn to speak, and David Martin was in such a state, he said, I now call Mr. Goering. I mean Dr. Goebbels. I mean Mr. Goebbels. So for the rest of us, it's wonderful to be here. Anyway, look, the reason I was keen to come here, it is a long way from Brussels to Adelaide, but the reason I was keen to come here was to thank you for giving us Corey as one of the state senators. He is a real patriot. He's a champion of the Conservative cause. There's a fair number of people I was speaking to over drinks just now who have either been in elected politics or are currently representatives of one kind or another. And I'm guessing, guys, that you will know, those of us who are in this career, you will know something that perhaps you have to have been in politics to appreciate, which is the extent to which it is unusual to go in determined to get outcomes. It's very easy in public life to settle into looking as though you did your best, to positioning yourself so that nobody can blame you. You know, that you ticked the boxes, you voted the right way. Corey is one of that handful of elected representatives who wants to change the status quo. He isn't happy with the world as he found it, and he's determined to improve it. And all of us owe him a huge debt for that. And so those of you who supported him, those of you who have supported him in the Liberal Party, you really are, you have my huge gratitude. He's a man I'm proud to call a friend. That's really, I think, all I've got to say, so thank you all for coming. But while I'm on my feet, you know, somebody, I said to somebody else before, you know, what would you like me to talk about? And he said, why don't you tell us how things are going in Europe? All right. I mean, this is, I think I can best do that by quoting my favourite Boris Yeltsin story in a crowded field of good Boris Yeltsin stories. The President of Russia came, when he was still President, to do a press conference in London. And he was asked by a British journalist, in a word, Mr. President, what is the condition of the Russian economy? And he said, good. And the journalist said, Mr. President, in a word is an English turn of phrase. You don't literally need to answer in a word. You can elaborate a little bit. Yeltsin paused and he said, not good. That's pretty much how it is in Europe. I mean, it's good in the sense that the intellectual foundations of this whole project are now visibly falsified. It's not good in the sense that members of the Euro elites, the Brussels apparatchiks, are responding to the crisis by accelerating all of the policies that caused it in the first place. People often don't realise how lucky they are. It's human nature to be blasé about what you take for granted. I mean, I've been in Australia for 4 days with my 10-year-old daughter, and almost everyone we met was saying, oh, we apologise for the bad weather. It's been a really filthy summer. Now, we've come from the most icy weather in winter, and we're thinking, what are you complaining about? And you know, I would make a similar point about the state of the economy more widely. I mean, I know you've got a government that is determined to blow away the surplus and is accelerating its way through all the money and is bizarrely adopting a carbon tax and doing all these crazy things, but you know what? There is not a politician in Europe who would not gladly exchange your problems for ours. Your unemployment rate is half that in the EU. Your debt to GDP ratio is 1/4 of that in the EU. No. There are many worse problems to have than a short lived, as we hope, government squandering an economic golden legacy. The more time I spend here, and I think this is something I have in common with a lot of British visitors, the more wistful I become. The more it occurs to me that Australia is a model of what we might have been if we were still living under our own laws and our own people in a sovereign country. It's a funny thing, we're 22 miles from Europe, but we're still among strangers when we travel there. I mean, among friends, but among strangers. There's no question that we're abroad. Here, you know, it's hard to be much further from the United Kingdom and still be on dry land than I am at the moment. And obviously this is an independent country, a different country, a distant country, but I don't feel among strangers. It's not properly foreign. Our political systems are similar, we exchange ideas, we exchange personnel, and yet we notice the big difference, which is that although your parliament looks a bit like ours, and the forms of address are similar, and the party system is compatible and all the rest of it, your MPs still get to run the country. And that's what makes us feel so wistful. This is almost, from our point of view, like the control in a scientific experiment. It's the model of what we could have achieved if we hadn't made this epical mistake of handing away our independence 40 years ago. I said on TV here the other night that it was the worst mistake of my lifetime. I wasn't choosing my words lightly. From that categorical error have flowed almost all of the problems that we see today. I can kind of understand why it happened. I mean, the 70s were not a good time for us. You know, the sunshine that I come across in Oz is figurative as well as literal. You know, there's an optimism here, there's a positive feeling, there's a patriotism that is in pretty short supply in the old world at the moment. And it was certainly in short supply in the early 70s when the United Kingdom made this fateful decision. In those days, we had the double-digit inflation, we had the trade union difficulties, we had the strikes, the power cuts, and we looked across the channel and we thought, these guys have obviously been getting something right. You know, they suffered much more badly than we did in the war, they had their infrastructure destroyed and degraded, and they'd all outperformed us. And maybe we thought we're going to be hitching our wagon to a powerful locomotive. In retrospect, our timing could not have been worse. Western Europe had indeed grown very impressively between 1945 and the year we joined, 1973. It pretty much stopped growing in 1974 with the oil crisis, and it never really got going again. Here's a pretty scary statistic from our point of view. The year that we joined, 1973, Western Europe, which I'll define for these purposes as the 15 members of the EU prior to the eastward enlargement, prior to the admission of the former communist states. Western Europe in 1973 accounted for 38% of world GDP. Today it's 24%, and in 2020 it will be 15%. Far from hitching our wagon to a powerful locomotive, we shackled ourselves to a corpse. Far from joining a growing and prosperous market, we have confined ourselves in a cramped and declining customs union. And in doing so, we unforgivably turned away from the parts of the world where the growth still was, not least this country, and the wider community of free English-speaking democracies, the countries to which we're linked by habit and sentiment, by outlook and history, by blood and speech. And the bizarre thing is not just that our trade was artificially redirected, and that our politics were artificially redirected, but the extent to which our cultural elites even began to try to reorient the way in which we looked at ourselves in the world. And as long as they had a media monopoly, they were able to do it. But of course, one of the many great things about the proliferation of online resources is that they can't do it anymore. You know, the one bit of prep I did as my before coming out here was I was looking at an article written at the time of your last general election, and it appeared in The Guardian, which is our main left-wing paper, and it was written by a very Europhile, soft left, sort of bien pensant, as we old Brussels-hams say, columnist, and it was entitled "The Internet Has Trapped Us in the Anglosphere," and it was written in a very huffy and peevish tone. And the author, you know, unable to disguise his annoyance, said, you know, people in Britain are more interested in the Australian election than in what's happening in Nord-Pas-de-Calais. I mean, he actually said this, unaware of how hilarious that sounded. Like, for goodness sake, how could we not be? You know, it's the same political system. We all have family here. It's where we phone at New Year. It's where we, you know, is where we come on holiday. It's, you know, we welcome people the other way around. But both of the party leaders were born in the United Kingdom, for heaven's sake. How could we not be interested? But what a revealing thing. What a revealing glimpse into the extent to which our leftist cultural elites believed that they could not only reorient our commercial profile, but change the way we think about ourselves, actually make us interested in Europe, rather than in the wider community of free peoples. I'd like to leave a little bit of time for discussion, but let me just touch on what I think it is that our countries have in common. Because, as I began by saying, we can take things for granted, we can become very casual about these things. If you think about the Western world and what we've achieved, in a political sense, really we're talking about the Anglosphere. I mean, it's all, you know, it's great to have occasional auxiliaries and stuff, but the people who have fought for parliamentary democracy and freedom and the rule of law, it's the same lineup of countries, again and again. It's you and us, the United States, Canada, and New Zealand. And why? What is it that makes us behave that way? What is it, in fact, that sets us apart from countries which are immediate neighbours? What is it that we have in common with you but not with the French? Or indeed not with the Indonesians? It begins with a truly extraordinary thing. And the more I think about it, the harder it becomes to explain. But at some stage in our prehistory, we developed this extraordinary idea that the law did not emanate from the government, but that rather predated the government. The first thing to set us apart was this extraordinary, sublime idea of common law, which absolutely redefined the relationship between state and citizen. So unlike in the continental Bonapartist system, where the state sits above the law and generates the legislation, we, from somewhere, had come up with this idea of an inherited folk right of freedoms which were above the government, and that even the king had to obey it. Where did we get it from? We don't know. We inherited it from our fathers, they from theirs. It disappears somewhere in the Dark Ages. But from that categorical difference flowed so much else. Our development of representative democracy, our belief that laws should not be passed nor taxes levied except by our own elected representatives, legislative control of the executive, personal freedom, the values which our fathers, yours and mine, were prepared to defend with force of arms. And also from that framework comes something else which sets us apart, which is that we have a civic rather than an ethnic conception of nationhood. Anyone who signs up to those values gets to belong. We don't define our nationality, as a number of European countries do, in terms of blood descent. In fact, we go back 100 years and 80% of British subjects were neither white nor Christian. And yet, on 2 occasions in the last century, hundreds of millions of young men were prepared to cross half the world in order to fight for a country that they'd never set eyes on, because they believed that the values that it stood for were their values too. If you sign up to that premise of separation of church and state and democracy and rule of law and parliamentary supremacy, that is open to anybody. It doesn't matter if you've come to Britain from somewhere else, if your grandfather was from Jamaica or Bengal, doesn't matter if you come to Australia and your grandfather was from Korea or Vietnam or even Italy. Well, actually Italy's stretching it quite a bit, but you get the general picture. It is an extraordinary thing that sets, and again, we take it for granted. We may now be coming to the end of a couple of 100 years where the preponderant civilizational force in the world has been that of the free English-speaking nations. We can all read the data, we can all see what's happening. we can all see the way in which power is tilting. And when you look at some of the alternatives, sure, we've made mistakes, we've had our shameful moments, what country hasn't, but I wonder whether we're not going to look back rather wistfully on what is now coming to a close. Maybe that our strength is spent, but I hope we're not completely finished yet. Thank you.